Why did Anakin lose to Obi-Wan? Anakin Skywalker versus Obi-Wan Kenobi, one of the most epic nail-biting duels in all of Star Wars, but why did Anakin actually lose? Now, it's easy to just say the high ground here and that's it, but there is a deeper explanation to this that comes from a few sources such as the novelization of Revenge of the Sith. So let's get right into it. From start to finish, you'll notice that within their fight, their blade-to-blade combat was identical. In the novelization, it states that the two knew each other better than brothers. They were the complementary halves of a single person, and this comes from their thousands of hours of lightsaber training together. They knew each other's strengths, weaknesses, and what move they were going to perform next. It's a huge reason why we see them block every one of each other's strikes to precision, and it's also why we saw them just spin their sabers here and match their force pushes as well. But there is one difference between the two, their lightsaber forms. As for Obi-Wan, he was a master of the lightsaber form called Form 3, or also known as Surisu. Since Obi-Wan was one of the weaker Jedi on the council, he needed to make up for it by practicing in other areas, and well, one of these areas was the saber combat, and Surisu fitted his style perfectly. Now, Surisu was all focused on defense and to really conserve your energy throughout a fight to outlast your opponent. Most Surisu users would usually stay patient throughout their duel and wait until their enemy would make a mistake because of frustration or fatigue. Sound familiar? Well, according to Mace Windu himself, he believed Obi-Wan was the master of this form and nobody even came close to his skill level, which is why the council chose him to be the one to fight Grievous earlier in the movie. They knew that because of how skilled he was in defense, he would be the best option to defeat the droid general, which of course he did. Now, unlike Obi-Wan, Anakin on the other hand was the complete opposite. Not only was he younger, more athletic, and physically stronger than Obi-Wan, but he was able to master the lightsaber form called Form 5. More specifically, the Gem Cell variant. This form was the complete opposite to what Obi-Wan used, as Anakin's form focused all on being violent with powerful strikes and ending fights as quickly as possible. Anyone who used this style was normally bloodthirsty and impatient, as they wanted to do whatever it took to dominate a fight and end it fast. A good example of this is what Anakin did to Dooku earlier in the film. As soon as Anakin tapped into his rage in that fight, he became more and more powerful with every slash of his blade and kept pushing Dooku until he couldn't take it anymore. Then from there, he was able to finish him off quickly. So, now that we understand the difference between the two and what their fighting styles were, you'll notice how this plays into their duel. From start to finish, Anakin was always the one on the aggressive side, as you can see that he was always on the attack by constantly pushing Obi-Wan backwards. This made Obi-Wan stay on the defensive for a lot of their fight, but he didn't just stay on the defense because he was good at that technique. Another reason why he was constantly on the defensive was because he didn't want to end Anakin. The last thing he wanted to do was to kill his best friend. At one point during the fight, Obi-Wan told himself that the man he was facing was somebody he devoted his entire life to ending. A murderer, a traitor, a fallen Jedi, and a Dark Lord of the Sith. But that didn't matter to him. He still loved him. So many times throughout their years together, he'd cover for him, make excuses for him, and even though he always knew about his secret relationship with Padme, he never told a single soul, all out of love for his brother. So, Obi-Wan tried reasoning with him throughout the fight. He tried telling him that the Chancellor was evil, and he did whatever he could to try and talk sense into his friend, but this sadly only fueled Anakin. Unlike him, Anakin wanted to finish him off fast and quickly. From start to finish, all he wanted to do was prove that he was stronger than his master and that the dark side had truly made him more powerful. However, because the fight was going on for as long as it did, this began to frustrate him. He was furious that he couldn't break through Obi-Wan's defenses, and so as a result, he started to make more and more mistakes because he was so blinded by just ending him already. His lightsaber strikes began to get sloppy, his movement was getting sluggish, and his anger started to consume him. But as for Obi-Wan on the other hand, his thoughts began to shift. Remember how I said a bit ago that he never wanted to end Anakin? Well, since the fight had been going on for so long, he realized he had made a huge mistake. This mistake was his attachment. As the duel started to come to a close, he knew that as long as he stayed attached to Anakin, he would never come out alive. So to protect himself, he knew that he had to let go of his attachment to Anakin, as well as his hopes, his fears, and his promise to Qui-Gon that he made all those years ago. In that moment, he decided to come to terms that he wasn't fighting Anakin anymore, but instead, he was fighting Darth Vader, whom he had no attachment to. And let's just say, Obi-Wan did just that. As the two eventually approached the lava bank, fatigue started to kick in for Obi-Wan, and he knew that this fight couldn't last for much longer. Right now, they were just going back and forth, and if someone was going to win this battle, something had to change. So, Obi-Wan then made a calculated move that would impact the entire fate of the galaxy. He performed the backflip to land on top of the hill, and that's where everything changed. As he stood there, he then made the decision to tell Anakin that he had the high ground, but the reason why he said this is deeper than what we ever saw on screen. Ever since Anakin was a young boy, he was always fascinated by Obi-Wan's fight against Maul, and that even though Maul had the high ground, Obi-Wan was able to leap over him and slice him in half. This amazed Anakin as a kid, and over time he became so obsessed with the duel that he even programmed his own training droid to look identical to Maul. This droid moved like him, acted like him, and even fought like him, and Anakin was able to build this all from his imagination. On top of it, he'd always bombard Obi-Wan with questions about specifics about the fight and things he did to make that move happen. So now over a decade later, Obi-Wan used that weakness to his advantage. He knew Anakin's obsession to prove himself, and well, he was right. As Anakin then leaped in the air, he tried to do the same exact move that Obi-Wan did to Maul all those years ago, but unfortunately for him, Obi-Wan was one step ahead of him. He knew he would try this, and he was ready for him. Using a finishing move called Mu-K, Obi-Wan sliced off not one, but 3 of Anakin's limbs with one swift strike of his saber. It was over. Because of his arrogance, his need for victory, and his ego, the Chosen One was defeated. All Anakin wanted to do was to prove that the dark side had made him stronger, and that he was the master now. He was tired of being held back from the Jedi for so many years, so by leaping over Obi-Wan to defeat him, he believed that he'd finally prove that he was more powerful. But he was wrong. Despite him being more talented and being more gifted in both the Force and lightsaber combat, Obi-Wan was able to outsmart his fallen apprentice. Sadly though, despite him defeating him, it wasn't what he ever wanted. Obi-Wan never wanted it to come to this, and it's why he kept telling Anakin throughout the duel to come to his senses, and it's also why he told him not to try it at the end. Even though his best friend became this horrible monster, he still loved him, but sadly, he left him with no choice. Now, it really makes you think, if there was no high ground, would Anakin have won? Well, according to Darth Sidious, he originally believed Kenobi stood no chance against Anakin, so when he found out that his new apprentice lost, he was shocked. Originally, he held Anakin in such a high category, but after learning the details on what happened in the duel, Sidious believed the reason why Obi-Wan won was because he knew Anakin too well. Despite the high ground, Obi-Wan knew every single one of Anakin's moves, even though Anakin was way stronger. Sidious ultimately believed that if Obi-Wan didn't spend thousands of hours training with Skywalker, then he wouldn't have stood a chance against the new Sith Lord. But this of course wasn't the reality, and instead, Anakin was outsmarted by his former master. It really makes you think how many things could have gone differently in the fight that could have led to Anakin winning. What if there was no high ground? What if Obi-Wan never knew his fighting style that well? Or what if Anakin had trained in the dark side for longer? There could have been so many factors that could have turned this fight around, but regardless of all that, it all came down to his arrogance. Even though Anakin had tons of different options than to jump over him, he ignored those. I mean, he could have easily waited for the pod to reach the end of the lava bank and just step over and continue the fight with Obi-Wan, but again, he was way too blinded to see those options. He had tunnel vision, and in his eyes, jumping over Obi-Wan would have ended the fight quickly, and even more than that, prove how powerful he was. Even though he was more powerful than Obi-Wan, his loss came from his ego and from believing that his new dark side powers could make up for him having the low ground. But we all know that ended up being the complete opposite. But what do you think? If there was no high ground, who do you think would have won? Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this duel breakdown, and if you want to learn why Vader lost to Luke in Return of the Jedi, then click the video in the middle of the screen right here.